Hey everybody, Peter Maravellis here on behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers and our partners here at Gray Area. I'd like to welcome you all to day one of the Logic Books Festival. Over the course of the next 3 days, we'll be exploring the way we interact with technology and how it affects our lives. We'll also be celebrating an important new collaboration between Logic Magazine and the publisher FSG Originals. Logic Magazine was founded 3 years ago with the aim of exploring technology and its effects on culture and deepening the discourse around technology. Its founders and editorial staff came from a unique position in that they were kind of embedded in the worlds of tech industry and tech culture and were really qualified to offer a very good critical eye. Logic publishes its journal 3 times a year and challenges the promises that tech industry makes versus what they actually deliver. A specific theme is chosen for each seasonal issue and then rigorously explored in all of its aspects. So Logic's goal has always been to ask the right questions. These would include such questions as, how do tools and technology work? Who finances and builds them? How are they used? Whom do they enrich? And whom do they impoverish? And what would a sustainable and more equitable technology or technologies look like? So over the course of this evening and the next 3 days, we'll be considering many of those questions. So before we begin, I would like to bring attention to the good work of Gray Area, our co-presenter and producer of tonight's event. Gray Area is a cultural center and educational hub located in San Francisco's Mission District. Their mission is to apply art and technology to create social and civil impact through education, incubation, and public events. They use digital tools to create art and design projects that benefit society. So to learn more about their calendar of events and workshops, please do visit grayarea.org. I'd like to take a moment to thank Nadav, Tiffany, Matthew, and the rest of the gang at Gray Area for all their good work. It's been a real pleasure working with them in the past, and City Lights is honored and thrilled to be working with them again on this really fantastic project. So our first session tonight is called Voices from the Valley. Tech workers talk about what they do and how they do it. It's named after the book of the same title. As for each event over the course of the next few days, there is a book tie-in. There are 4 new books in the series, and we'll be happily featuring all of them over the course of the week. So we're going to be posting links in the chat function of your dashboard with which you can purchase copies of the book throughout the course of the event. We're going to be having a Q&A at the end. I encourage you all to use the Q&A function to post your questions. Our speakers tonight are the authors of Voices of the Valley. I would like to welcome Ben Tarnoff and Moira Weigel. They will be in conversation with Anna Wiener. Ben is the author of A Counterfeiter's Paradise and The Bohemians and is co-founder of Logic Magazine. His writing and various works have appeared in The Guardian, The New Republic, Jacobin, and Lapham's Quarterly, amongst other publications. He makes his home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Moira Weigel is the author of Labor of Love, The Invention of Dating. Her writing has appeared in The New York Times, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, The Guardian, The Nation, and +One, as well as many other publications. She is also the co-founder of Logic Magazine. She received a fellowship to the Harvard Society of Fellows in 2016 and also lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They're going to be joined by Anna Wiener, who writes about tech culture for The New Yorker. She is the author of Uncanny Valley, a book about her time working for Silicon Valley startups. It was published by MCD and Farrar, Straus and Giroux this year. She makes her home in San Francisco Bay Area. So, hey, everybody, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having us, and thanks to City Lights and to Gray Area and to FSG Originals for organizing this, and to Logic. I do want to encourage everyone while we're here and getting started to purchase these books. They're fantastic. There's a link in the chat where you can buy them from City Lights, a San Francisco institution. And now we've got the sales pitch out of the way, I thought maybe we could kick things off a little bit just talking about what Logic is. This magazine's been around since 2016. Moira and Ben, you are 2 of the 4 co-founders, 2 of the editors. And you know, what is the project? What's the magazine? How did it get such a fantastic title? I'll let you guys take it from here.
Thank you. Thanks for the question, Anna, especially about the title, which we'll get to. And thank you to City Lights and Gray Area, FSG, Anna, yourself, everyone who made this possible, and to everyone for being here. I know it's a busy time when folks have a lot to do, and we're so glad you joined us. Logic. How do we get started? So in 2016, as Anna sort of hinted, and she knows because she was there, the idea for Logic sort of started percolating among a group of friends living in the Bay Area. A lot of us worked in the tech industry, some of us didn't, but I think we all shared a sense that the main media narratives that we were reading about Silicon Valley and the tech industry we're missing something, maybe missing a couple different things. On the one hand, you know, that there was what I think you, Anna, called the breathless tech press, you know, sort of the TechCrunch and others covering business in a way that was sort of close to the business, maybe too close to the business, sometimes felt like reprinted press releases, with all due respect to the many good journalists at TechCrunch. And then on the other hand, some of the longer form East Coast publications we'd grown up with, which were sometimes more critical, felt very far from the world that we were living in. We felt like there was a real gap. Sometimes we said between the sycophants and the scold, but in any case, in covering the realities that we were living in and sort of the texture of everyday life, which was not, you know, again, this sort of bombastic business narrative or this scoldy Facebook friendships aren't real friendships narrative or whatever the analysis was back in 2015, 2016. And actually, I don't want to go on too long, but this moment when Anna read from her story, Uncanny Valley, which also came out in 2016 at Green Apple Books on the Park, was this other really big moment, I think, when the group of us thought, oh, like maybe there's really something to this. Anna had just published her story, Uncanny Valley, and N+1, and it had a huge reception, as I bet some folks here may remember. And we went to this reading at Green Apple Books on the Park on a Friday night, I think, a neighborhood that is not necessarily convenient to a ton of tech workers. And the place was packed, just completely packed, which is no surprise given how good a story or piece it was. But at the time confirmed our sense, you know, that not only we saw a gap, but there was a whole world of people who wanted to be described and have their lives described in ways that weren't sales pitches or cliches. And I feel like Logic started, at least partly, in that moment and from that impulse. Ben, do you wanna take it, say any more? Did I tell the story all right?
Yeah, I think that was beautifully told. I would add just a little bit more history, which is that when we launched our first issue in March 2017, we did so at City Lights in the poetry room upstairs, which you can see the photo of City Lights up on the call now, just a little bit through that hallway and up to the left. And that was another place where we kind of felt that hunger that Moira was describing, that we felt at Anna's reading, where there was this community out there that wanted to be catered to. You know, their experiences, particularly the experiences of rank and file tech workers, were not really being represented very widely at that point. And that was certainly not the only reason we started Logic, but a really important impetus for doing so. And I'd also just add, you know, echoing Moira's points, that we're so grateful to Peter and City Lights for having us back. It's a sacred place, I think, for us. I spent a lot of my childhood there. So for me personally, it means a lot. But yeah, very grateful to be here and be able to do this virtually in these weird times.
I just want to correct the record and say that it was an N+1 launch party, the first ever in San Francisco, which I think, which is why there were people there. And Maura also read from her piece from the issue, but we can congratulate each other later. I think one of the, if my memory is right, which it may not be, one of the reasons that we started talking about Logic and you guys started reaching out to people was also that, you know, Maura, you come from an academic background and you knew that there were people doing rigorous, in-depth research about tech and its impact in different areas and how it was built and what the sort of design incentives were, and really contextualizing it in different ways. And a lot of that was missing from the tech press and from the business press. And so I think part of it, I think the phrase that maybe Peter used that I've seen tossed around about logic is deepen the discourse. And so I think it was also bridging sort of that academic rigorous work with popular coverage. I think often academic publishing can be very slow, and there are good reasons for that. But tech moves very quickly as a story and as an industry. So I think that, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding was always that was also a very important part of the equation.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you for giving me a chance to say the thing I always like to say, which is that the only real reason to start a magazine is to throw parties, tragic as it is to remember now in the time of COVID. But it was absolutely part of the mission from the beginning, not just to try to fill in a gap or a space that we saw, but also to bring together these different communities who were doing really interesting work, who seemed to be siloed or working, separately. And some of those folks were academics, some were activists, tech workers. We talked about artists, some journalists. I'm sure I'm forgetting categories, but that, cramming everyone into the poetry room, or at least into the page of a physical issue together, was certainly a big part of our raison d'etre.
Yeah, and I think I remember that being extremely exciting to sort of look around this room and see all these other people, many of whom worked in the industry or around the industry. And personally just feeling, I worked in tech at the time still, and feeling like, oh, other people feel this way and other people want this. And that was, that was invigorating. I want to talk a little bit about, just to segue into the book that we are celebrating tonight. I want to talk a little bit about a sort of recurring feature that you guys have put in the magazine in Logic, which is the anonymous interview with a tech worker. And I believe might be based on on something that N+1 has done, and I think did in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. Tell me a little bit about that form and about the thinking behind putting that into the magazine.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was something we spent actually a fair bit of the first issue of the magazine on, an anonymous interview, portion of which actually appears in the book, anonymous interview with a data scientist. And it quickly kind of became for us, as you mentioned, a regular feature, and it's something we've done in almost every issue since then. For us, what was so valuable about the form, what continues to be valuable about the form, is that we're enabling folks to speak very candidly about their work, about their situation, about their industry, and to bring voices that are typically not in the conversation about tech, or historically have not been in the conversation about tech, into the room. Moira mentioned, like, we want to throw a party. We're not allowed to throw parties anymore, but that was kind of the ideal of like what makes Logic useful, is bringing different people from different communities into the same room. And I think analogous to that, the purpose of Logic, and I think more specifically the purpose of this book, is to bring more voices into the tech conversation. This is a conversation that typically is dominated by people at the top, investors and executives, who speak very freely, sometimes too freely, on social media, through the mainstream media as they're sought for quotes by reporters. And the folks who are part of these various rank and file layers of the industry, whether white collar or blue collar, whose labor actually makes the industry run, are often not heard from. That's changed a little bit with a series of tech worker mobilizations in recent years, but I think it's fair to say that their voices are still underrepresented relative to the folks at the top. So that was another hope. And I think there's a moral, kind of political value to that, but it's also frankly just very interesting. I think a lot of people read that first data scientist interview because it just offered, frankly, a lot more insight into what the technology was and what it wasn't, and the kind of looking beyond the PR and the hype and the headlines than they would have gotten elsewhere.
Yeah, Moira, do you want to add to that? I saw you nodding.
choreography of Zoom. Yeah, I was just gonna say, I mean, yes to everything Ben said, and I just wanted to amplify his final point that, in a sense that there was a politics to this project of wanting to bring out the anonymous voices, maybe even an ethics to it without being grandiose, but there was a literary, there is, I hope, sort of a literary dimension to it too, of wanting to get the texture of people's lives and of the everyday. And there's, an American tradition of writing about labor movements and about work. We could think of Studs Terkel and Vivian Gornick. And there's also, these new millennial novels of work, which yours isn't a novel, it's a memoir, but I would include your book in too. And I think those are some of our inspirations. And it felt like the chance to listen to people and get to try to fill in some of that texture of the everyday in describing a world that's so important, and the tech industry shapes all of our personal lives, all of our social lives. God knows it shapes our civic life and our democracy, or what's left of it. And yet it can be so hard to get information about how it's made. So anyway, I think that our hope was to give a fuller picture from the inside, but a different kind of insider picture. And one that hopefully has a little more variation than people had seen.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about secrecy and about the different ways that the industry protects itself, and why these narratives have been, or were for a long time, uncommon. I think there's also something maybe we can get to later about changing attitudes in Silicon Valley among leadership toward the media, toward sort of traditional press, not media that comes from inside of Silicon Valley, such as Substacks or whatever. Because I do think that it's changed, and people are not as willing to speak freely through the media, but employees are, workers are, rank and file, contractors are. Sorry, I have a window open, I will close it. But I think one of the things that is really interesting about this book is that it demystifies a lot of the labor that happens inside of these companies. And it also assigns a new language to it in a certain way. And I think that marketing and language is so much a part of the Silicon Valley, I don't even know, impenetrability in a way. And I know that that's something that you both have thought about quite a lot, is just the sort of linguistic terms of the industry. Do you want to chat about that a little bit?
Yeah, I would say briefly, I'm sure Maura has a lot to say on the subject. I would say briefly, while Anna closes her window, that power is held and exercised by Silicon Valley at many levels. Language is one of those levels, and I think in a very small way, at Logic and with this book, we're trying to kind of erode or challenge that power to do what we can. And I think specifically how that power is implemented along the lines that you suggested, Anna, is through mystification. And we see this with a lot of the most prominent terms that are associated with the industry. AI comes to mind. Enormous amount of ambiguity and kind of deliberate obfuscation around what AI actually is. This is one of the things that many people found most entertaining about the interview with the data scientist, is just really blowing up a lot of the hype around AI. So yeah, I think that is really important work, because part of the task of bringing these technologies under a degree of democratic control, to be a little grand about it, requires us and us broadly defined, actually being able to understand how they work and who the people are that make them work. And I think that latter piece is particularly important, actually seeing the humans inside these platforms at all these different layers of the platforms, because that idea itself is suppressed by the Silicon Valley leadership class. This is a point that we make in the introduction to the book, but that it's very important to industry elite to sell this narrative that the platforms run themselves. And we know that that's not true. There's been a lot of great reporting on all of the different types of often low paid, precarious, and dangerous work that makes these platforms possible. But that's a point that we need to continue to reiterate as we demystify some of this language.
I'd say also, it's interesting, we started out talking about 2016 and this moment when the magazine started, when it felt like in many ways, a certain kind of optimistic or cyber utopian narrative that maybe began with Obama, maybe began earlier, but a certain kind of optimism about, or credulity, I might say, about many of these companies prevailed. Of course, Snowden had happened, Gamergate had happened, people were processing, the rise of the alt-right and Trump and sort of watching all these properties of networks that have been touted as beneficial, show their bad side or something, so the flip side of the wealth of networks is the madness of the crowd, as Tim Hwang put it in our first issue. But I think what's interesting is that now, in 2020, I'd say there's a much more developed sort of public tech critique, right? We've had big books like Shoshana Zuboff's Surveillance Capitalism. We've had politicians across the aisle attacking big tech. We've seen, The Social Dilemma is one of the top films on Netflix or whatever. And so we've shifted, there's been this shift where I'd say a certain kind of criticism that we maybe felt was lacking in 2016 seems more common. And yet, in so many cases, it still speaks the language of the industry, right? So it's like even the term platform is an industry term. It's a kind of advertising term. There's a way in which the critiques on offer often take at face value the hype. And there are reasons for that, which have to do with secrecy, which we were just talking about. It's actually quite hard to find out in detail about how many of the products these companies make work. But I think it felt really important to us not to be too credulous and not to sort of depend on advertising or marketing material when formulating our critique. And it seems like the way to do that is to go to people who actually build the tools we're talking about. Not that we're the only people doing that for sure. I think there are a whole lot of academics and journalists trying to rethink some of this language now, but our hope with this book was to sort of get to do it with and get wisdom about it from people actually working with the systems we're talking about.
I wonder if we can talk just maybe briefly about some of the interviews that are in the book and some of the things that surprised both of you. And Ben, you work in the industry, Moira, you do not. I think that kind of hybrid of perspectives is really interesting. Was there anything that you felt personally sort of upended how you were thinking about things or about platforms or about, I'm thinking we were talking about language and sort of shifting ideas of how it tacks to the shifting ideas of the industry. And I was thinking about something you had pointed out to me years ago, Moira, when we were talking about women in tech and how when I entered the tech industry, or I guess when I was looking for jobs in 2012, that meant something very specific. That meant white women in tech. That meant sort of lean in, Sheryl Sandberg, non-ironic girl boss stuff. And then the conversation about diversity, I think, became more expansive. But we still don't really, when speaking about women in tech or women of color in tech, that often means full-time white collar workers. It tends to ignore people who are working as maintenance staff or cafeteria staff or contractors. So anyway, yeah, I'm curious if there are specific examples that you might bring up from the book or from sort of your research around it, working at Logic, that could be interesting for people who are watching us.
So I want to stick the question of what surprised us to Ben, but I just want to say that insight belongs to Rachel Melendez, who is the co-founder of Tech Workers Coalition. She was the one who I first heard make this point on a panel, I think, in 2016, I think, that, there was so much talk about the lack of women and lack of diversity in tech, and when in fact, the single largest demographic on most tech campuses was Latino women, but it was just that nobody was used to seeing. And when I say nobody, I should say the media or the way the industry talks. I think it's important not to assume that perspective when talking about the problem, but Rachel's point, when she made that point, I think, was, there's this denigration of a whole massive category of worker, a real invisibilization. And that, I think, was such a important and foundational insight, or, a really important shift of frame that was important for Tech Workers Coalition, and also really struck me at the time, which is, I'm sure, why I repeated it to you. Ben, what else surprised us?
Well, I think just building on that insight, that's one of the core ideas that animates the book, which is trying to enlarge the definition of the tech worker. I think that's a really important point, that the tech worker is not just the full-time software engineer at Google. It's anyone who performs work for a software company, whatever the type of work, whatever the employment status, whether contract, full-time, so-called independent contractors, whatever. And I think that definition helps us see new connections, new points of contact between different kinds of workers in really useful ways. I think it's obviously important to recognize the vast differences that separate, say, a security guard at Facebook from a software engineer at Facebook. You don't want to submerge or erase those differences. But I think we can learn a lot by uncovering the points of contact, the shared points in their experience, which at various junctures in recent years has served as the basis for some very inspiring relationships of solidarity that have led to coordinated collective action. There have been a number of campaigns by blue collar workers in Silicon Valley campuses, which is a subject that one of our interview subjects gets into a little bit, in which white collar full-time employees have lent critical support, and in some cases been very useful to those unionization efforts. But I would say, just expanding on that a little bit, the kind of class structure of the tech industry is really complex. And I think I had not fully internalized that before we began this project and before we started having these conversations. I think it's easy to see the kind of like polarities of the ladder, like who's kind of at the top of the hierarchy and who's at the bottom of the hierarchy. But there are a lot of fairly subtle gradations in between that are sometimes only visible within a single firm. And these distinctions are inevitably racialized and gendered. They often center on the question of whose work is considered technical, which is itself often a very gendered and racialized question. But that surprised, I mean, not that gender and racial dynamics were so prominent, but the, how fine grained the distinctions can get, which is, I guess, if you think about it a little bit more, not surprising, but a little bit surprising when you come into tech, because the theory of these companies is that they're somewhat flat organizationally. And, you take a closer look and it's like, wow, this is like several Jane Austen novels of like social complexity. Like you could really, and this is, I feel like, Anna, your book does this brilliantly, but like there's so much there in terms of these like very fine class and social distinctions.
Yeah, I would add. Oh, sorry.
Oh no, sorry. I was just going to say, while Ben was talking, I thought of some of the most surprising moments that I blanked and panicked about when you first asked. But I think it's precise for me. It was precisely, and perhaps especially because I don't work in the tech industry, and I think I'm the only person at Logic, or one of maybe two people around Logic, who's never worked in the tech industry directly. Although I live around people who work in the tech industry. I think there were these moments of people reflecting on some of those kinds of internal distinctions or social dynamics within these ostensibly flat or non-hierarchical organizations that were very striking. There's one interview in the book with a longtime Googler who sort of talks about how some of for them, a lot of the big media narratives happening around Google actually boil down to or are driven by some changes in management practices and changes in how people relate to one another in the space of the office and the company. And it makes a ton of sense that, what we think of as culture wars often depend upon these everyday dynamics and interactions. There's an interview with a massage therapist who worked in-house at a big company for a time. And she talks about, speaking of expertise, these social dynamics where people whose bodies she was working on would contest her authority or sort of ask her a lot of questions about her training and what she was doing. And she speaks, to my mind, really interestingly about how, on the one hand, of course, this was obnoxious and irritating, but then part of her expertise and her technique is dealing with the body in front of her and sort of not reacting to those dynamics. So that was, I don't know, that was a memorable kind of moment for me in terms of thinking about how these relationships play out. There's also a moment, we have an interview with a founder who had a startup and then went to work at a big company, and this person, and I think of this example as a piece of emotional texture as well as being about class and social interactions, sort of individual or interior emotional texture. But this person, who I thought of as an extremely successful person from the outside, has this moment in their interview where they say, everything I've ever worked on has failed. Like everything I do fails. And that actually it's possible to continue failing up in this way. And sort of the texture of emotion that produced in the conversation in the interview, I thought was something much different and sort of had more shades to it than I had thought about before. And so, yeah, there are a lot, I hope, many moments that were surprising to me, I think to Ben, and hopefully for a reader, even if they do come from inside the tech industry, these moments of reframing can resonate across, sort of politically and then emotionally and psychologically too.
I want to just, before I ask the next question, I want to encourage people to drop questions in the Q&A box. We'll get to them probably in about 10 minutes. And yeah, I feel like when you have the opportunity to ask more Weigel a question, you ask it. So, so I wanted to ask you guys just we sort of started in 2016 and we've kind of alluded to it in our conversation, but I wanted to talk about what has changed, because the media landscape in which Logic was founded was very different, it feels to me, than it is now. The industry feels really different. Conversations about work are really different. Ben, you started talking a little bit about the organizing that's happening inside of tech companies, and I hope that you'll speak to that a little bit more, because I think that that's been a really important shift in writing about tech and how people are understanding, this sort of, it's kind of like the scrim that was pulled over workers at some of these companies has been lifted, but it's a very specific subset of workers and very specific conditions. So yeah, I don't know, what, in your view, what has changed? Have you had to adapt the magazine to keep up? How do you see it? What's your vantage point?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a big question because, as you alluded to, so much has changed since then. I think 2016 and the election in particular is the obvious inflection point. It's hard because, as always, is a question of continuity and discontinuity. One doesn't want to put too much emphasis on any one point, but I think the election was a turning point for a lot of different elements that you're alluding to, Anna. I mean, one, just kind of most obviously, there was, particularly in the Bay Area and Silicon Valley, this wave of politicization and in some quarters radicalization that sweeps the white collar layers in particular of these big tech firms. And this is manifests in a variety of organizing efforts that grow through 2017 and really kind of take off in 2018, a number of collective action campaigns against certain contracts with the military, with ICE, with law enforcement, and so on, campaigns that continue today and I think, that organizing efforts at the white collar level have continued, taken new forms. There have been a few successes of unionization. Kickstarter in particular has unionized, which is a very exciting, kind of historic victory. So you see organizing emerge, and I should maybe pull back and say that is kind of downstream maybe of this broader set of conversations that start unfolding within those white collar layers of the industry after the election, where I think it's fair to say that folks are thinking a little bit more about what kind of technologies they're building, who they're building it for, how their workplaces are run and organized. Again, there are a lot of folks in the industry already asking these questions, particularly women and people of color. So it's not like it started the day after the election, but it's safe to say that those conversations got a little bigger. They acquired a new tone of urgency. And I think that also created more of an appetite within the industry among rank and filers for a more critical perspective on technology of the kind that Logic was trying to bring. So in that sense, it was kind of fortuitous because there were a lot of individuals who worked in these firms who actually really wanted access to some of that scholarship that Moira was alluding to, or really wanted to learn about organizing efforts in other movements in the wider society. So it was a place where we could actually come in and play that kind of connective function, I think really nicely, that kind of aligned well. The other thing I would mention just briefly, I don't want to go on, is that the kind of techlash that grew out of 2016 and which kind of, again, maybe reaches escape velocity in 2018, I changed how tech is covered completely. And we could go on about this. I think it's probably beyond the scope of our conversation, but a lot of the kind of concerns that we raised in our manifesto, which we published shortly before our first issue, haven't gone away, but I think they're speaking to a media landscape that doesn't really exist anymore, as you're kind of alluding to. And I think there are new problems. I mean, I always have my criticisms, but I think there's a certain kind of naivete that has been lost. And I think we're having, as Moira said earlier, frankly, a more constructive, a more sophisticated conversation about technology. There's a lot of gaps and there are a lot of limitations to it, but I think it's a very different conversation than the one that we were entering when we started.
Do you think that some of the hostility that we're seeing from certain members of tech leadership toward the press, for a while I thought maybe it had something to do with the sort of Trumpian stance on the media, and I think obviously that's in the water. Silicon Valley has never been as liberal as everyone wishes it was. But do you think part of that has to do with this sort of organizing that's happening inside of companies, not just unionization, but collective action, some pushback on the direction some of these business models are taking, that actually the hostility toward the media is a hostility toward workers recognizing the power and the leverage that they have? Do you think that these things, I'm curious what your perspective on how those things dovetail is.
Yeah, 100%. And I'll answer just by teeing this up for Moira, because this is also something that Moira writes on and works on, which is also a subject of a great article by Natasha Tiku in the Washington Post just a few days ago, which is that there is a more prominent, more public kind of reactionary strain of thinking that we are seeing from tech leadership that I think is genuinely new. Now, these folks may have held these beliefs before, but I think the prominence and the kind of vehemence with which they're being expressed does feel new. And I think that is very related to these organizing efforts. I think there's a degree of real embattlement, a sense of resentment, a sense even of betrayal among many of these folks who inhabit the kind of investor and executive class that decisions about control over investment and production, which is, the prerogative of the capitalist and a capitalist system, are being contested by rank and filers who are demanding input into those decisions. One of the perennial demands of Google organizers has been a elected worker seat on the company board. And that's, that's something that I think that layer, that leadership layer really resents, and I think correctly perceives as a direct threat to their interests and to their power. But Moira, you've thought and written specifically about these kind of new reactionary formations within the Silicon Valley leadership class.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to say about that, and I'm weary of getting too sidetracked in it, because once I start going on it, I can go forever. But I think, if there was this idea for a long time, perhaps since the 90s, of what the media theorists Richard Barbrook and Andy Cameron famously called the Californian ideology, that Silicon Valley sort of incubated this new kind of politics that was liberal, libertarian, that was sort of anti-government and government regulation, but for gay marriage and the environment, and sort of socially liberal. I think that, and I'm obviously painting with a very broad brush, but I think that certain tensions and contradictions within that consensus have become untenable for a variety of reasons. I mean, I think, and again, I don't want to hijack the conversation to talk about this, but I think that, you know, some of it's about tensions internal to libertarian political philosophy. Some of it's about changing business models and changing technologies. You know, if your business model is to try to sell get cloud contracts with the Pentagon, you're gonna have a different culture than if your business model is trying to monetize anyone's attention. You know, anyway, there are a lot of factors that contribute to this shift, and a company like Palantir, which I've written about, I think is an particularly interesting site for thinking about it. But what I actually be curious to hear from Anna about is, I think that, you know, there's this more perhaps overtly reactionary political formation, or I like to use the term tech nationalist because that's a term some of these folks use for themselves. That kind of political formation that might feel new. There's the reaction of folks I don't exactly associate with the tech nationalists, not necessarily, sort of against employees speaking out. You know, there's that Coinbase letter a week ago or 2 weeks ago. All time is immaterial now, but recently, you know, these responses from management to workers speaking out on social and political issues. But then there's also what's happening to the media, right? I mean, just the number of layoffs and like newsroom closings since the beginning of COVID is staggering. And so it seems clear that these companies that for a long time were mostly just praised and now are being more criticized are having sort of retrenchments or doubling down. I think that leaks are especially upsetting at certain companies, Facebook famously, but elsewhere too. But then it seems hard to me to think through it fully without thinking about how the media landscape itself is changing too. And I'd be curious, Anna, what role, if any, you think that plays?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And to be totally honest, I don't think it's one that I have like a great answer to in the moment without fumbling through my thoughts for the next 20 minutes. But let me think about it maybe toward the end. If we run out of questions from people who are here with us, we can circle back to it, as they say. There are some actually great questions in here. There's one about the Coinbase letter that you just mentioned, which was a letter that Brian Armstrong, the CEO of Coinbase, wrote to employees essentially saying, we will give you a generous severance package or exit package if you quit, but we would like to banish political discourse from the company. Coinbase is a company that's trying to, I think, democratize finance, to use some total nonsense marketing speak in so many words. So we have a question that's asking, can we get some hot takes on the move to exile politics? Do you guys have a hot take? Anything you want to throw in there?
How hot? Scorching? I mean, I would say it's a good example of the kind of thing we've been talking about. And I would say that this does, I mean, if you see it from management's point of view, there are some like serious labor management issues that arise when you have workforces in which politics is kind of openly discussed and debated. I mean, I think it should be, and I think those are constructive conversations that can generate some interesting momentum for collective action. But I think, it will always be, it's an oft invoked line about the need to kind of suppress or downplay conversations that could be like polarizing or divisive. I think that kind of trope is actually a pretty old one and has been deployed long before 2016. I think that was often a kind of instrument whereby discussions around like diversity and inclusion and representation were suppressed long before 2016. So I think we should, recognize it as a fairly old strategy.
The only thing I would add, and I haven't followed that particular brouhaha all that closely, but the only thing I'd add that was interesting to me about the language of that letter was this, what struck me as a sort of exasperated tone of like, we're in a business, we're supposed to be making money and making a business, like leave all this stuff at the door, leave these social and political issues at the door. And it struck me that too is a kind of symptom. I think when ideology becomes visible as ideology, it's like a sign of crisis, right? Because ideology, when I use that word anyway, I mean these frames that all of us have for understanding reality, that are more and less, that are mystifying, that we walk around with in our heads. But when I say ideology, I don't think that someone is sitting there making Mr. Burns fingers, like pretending to think one thing and saying another. It's like a worldview that makes a kind of world making sense to people for a time. And so there was just something very striking to me about this exasperated tone of the boss saying like, come on, just like leave that stuff at home. That stuff doesn't belong at work. Because it seems to me that the kinds of social movements we're seeing around Black liberation, around feminism, some of the different, the various social issues that have come up and been controversial at these companies are precisely contesting the grounds of what's political and what's just business. And, I think for women and people of color, the idea that you would just, forget about these issues, wouldn't that be nice, is always kind of ironic. But anyway, that exasperated tone really, really struck me as a tone of someone who's not used to having their narrative or framework challenged.
Yeah, I think there's also a lot we could say about sort of productivity culture, and I think people in leadership being very afraid when they're, I think Ben was getting to this, when their employees are engaged in other things or have some time to think about the work that they're doing, the implications.
Since we were asked to be spicy, I do also feel I have to say that it's like, perhaps I just haven't paid attention to VC Twitter like consistently enough, but there does seem to be in VC Twitter, in Clubhouse, like some special things happening that also feel related to COVID boredom, right? It's like the curb your enthusiasm problem. People are just at home, they're bored, they sort of need to post things that will get angry reactions on social media. But also, I don't know, a certain trollishness where some of these statements, which are presented as non-controversial, are clearly designed to provoke a social media reaction, such that the person in question can then say, oh, look at the social justice warriors or the free speech police. These random grad students or rank and file people or whomever trying to silence me, a billionaire with an enormous platform, by making fun of me on Twitter. But there is a kind of compulsiveness to it that I think is not unrelated to quarantine boredom. That's my medium warm take.
Maura, please don't bring campus politics into this, radical campus politics. I think that actually that this gets what you're saying about sort of generating a response on something like Twitter or Clubhouse gets at a question that we have, and the link's a little tenuous, but someone asks, Uber, Lyft, and all have been spending tremendous amounts of money on propaganda for yes on Prop 22. This is a California ballot initiative proposition to carve out an exception to AB 5 to avoid classifying gig workers as full-time employees. When these tech firms control the distribution of information, how do we organize and how do we win? And I feel like that ties into this sort of, it's a similar question to how does one deal with the fact that there are people in leadership who are potentially instigating conversation, maybe because of COVID boredom, or maybe because they like to kick the bear's nest, or maybe because they can do so with impunity. How do we organize? How do we win when the distribution of information is controlled?
It's a great question. Well, on all things Prop 22, listen to Vina Dubal, whatever she says to do, just do that. I think that's our rule of thumb. Vina's a wonderful scholar and organizer who has contributed to Logic. and is in particular an expert on Prop 22. I mean, I think the broader question here is really connects to the themes of our conversation so far, the themes of this book, and the themes of logic, which is how do you create accurate narratives of what's actually going on when, as you put it, the information that you would need to do so is being withheld, or it's being presented in a highly kind of distorted way. This is something that we get into in particular in the conversation that closes the book, entitled The Storyteller, where we have a conversation with someone whose job it was to tell stories on behalf of a company, primarily externally, but we also talk about the kind of stories that this individual told themselves about the kind of work they were doing, the types of stories they told other people about the kind of work that they were doing. So kind of making better stories about our technology. I mean, that sounds a bit abstract, but I think, you know, it's kind of what we're talking about here, because that's really critical to establish a degree of democratic control over this industry, over these technologies.
Or did you want to add something? Sorry,
Oh, I was mostly, I have to admit, I've been distracted by some of the wonderful questions in the Q&A. Because that is my teacher brain, bad teacher brain. But I was going to say Vina Dubal, the Prop 22 expert who Ben mentioned earlier, who wrote a piece for the magazine a couple issues ago, I think it's for issue 10, that was great. Just did an event last week where she was talking a bit about some of the organizing strategies that drivers she's represented and worked with used. She talked about both, I could drop the link for that event in the chat if folks are interested, but she talked a bit about both the potential but also perils of sort of social media groups for drivers and gig workers more generally, that they can be spaces to form certain links, but also they can devolve into counterproductive, productive sort of disputes, and politics are not always representative. And she really did emphasize folks trying to get together in person. And then also an idea, she was in conversation with Tressie Cottom, and I think Tressie was the one who put it this way, but this idea also of organizing around shared risk, shared risks and liabilities, instead of necessarily all having to have the same identity. So these are two really small things. I'd be happy to put the link in, but yeah, Vina does have some concrete ideas about that. And I highly recommend to everyone looking up her work if they're interested in this.
We have two questions that are sort of about ethics and responsibility that I think actually go together really nicely. One is, have you noticed a shift after 2016 from tech leadership toward responsibility rhetoric? The person asking the question is interested to hear any hopefulness you have about this or about its limitations. And I think that certainly there's plenty to say about the sort of Tristan Harris figure, the social dilemma sort of content, I would call it. But I think that question is interesting when paired with another one from the chat, which is, when negotiating as unions, are there ethical terms being negotiated? Ethical as in how the tech is used.
Yeah, these are, sorry, Maura, did you want to take this one?
No, I was going to say Ben should take this one, was what I was going to say.
These are great questions. I mean, maybe to start with the second one, what has often been at stake in these organizing campaigns by white-collar workers at these firms has been the question of control, question of who has the power to control what we build, who we build it for, how our workplaces are organized, how we are managed. And sometimes this issue of control is presented as being something that is kind of outside of the traditional labor movement, that the traditional labor movement negotiates for wages and working conditions, but that the question of control over production and investment decisions, which we could also kind of gloss as the ethics of our work. What are we building and who are we building it for? Are in this narrative seen as kind of outside of traditional labor organizing. And historically, that's just not the case. I mean, the labor movement from its inception has always been about questions of control, and workers throughout the history of the labor movement have pushed to assert greater control over their work and over how their workplaces are organized. It's really an artifact of conservative American labor law that was codified decades ago, and a labor movement that has been deeply in retreat for decades. Those are really the reasons that we've come to adopt this much narrower, much more confined view of what organized labor does. And of course, there's a lot of wonderful militant workers that are in formal unions that are in fact organizing successfully for greater control. I know, I think of nurses unions who are trying to get more control over their workplaces by demanding and winning staffing requirements, and forming alliances with the communities of the people that they're caring for in favor of those staffing requirements. So we can see that demand, I think, reiterated in the more militant layers of the labor movement. But I think it's important. I hope I haven't drifted too far from the spirit of the question, but I think it's important to see these questions that are sometimes placed under the heading of ethics as actually being worker labor issues and labor issues that have a long tradition within the labor movement.
All right, I think we're very close to having to wrap up, but I want to encourage people to check out the chat where we have links to all of these books. So many of the things that we've talked about tonight are actually come up in each of these four new books, and I think they're all quite slender, and it's a wonderful series, and I encourage people to check them out. Ben is holding them up in a demonstration. I guess I want to close, if we may, if that's cool with you, Peter. Thanks. I want to close. There are a few questions that are fantastic questions in the Q&A box, but I think people are seem to be curious about what comes next. Where, if the industry is going to change, where will that change come from? Will it come from inside of the companies? Will it come from regulation? What could that regulation look like? Yeah, do you want to riff on that for a second before we say goodnight?
Maura?
I think I have to go first because I think my vision is darker. So I'm just going to create a situation where Ben can swoop in and save the day. I think, so what comes next for me personally, as I mentioned, is that I've been trying to think and grapple with these sort of shifting political philosophies of technology that I alluded to, this shift away from what Fred Turner called the counterculture to cyberculture synthesis, or I earlier called the Californian ideology, towards tech nationalism, with a more fragmented internet and a more nationalist one. But I think studying that properly really requires grounding inquiry, not just in what people say, but in how they work and what they're building. So I'm trying to work on that. It's a vision of the internet that is what I hope does not happen, but maybe, as Wendy Chun says, I can do an analysis. It's like a climate change model, right? It's an analysis of something that I hope will cause it, a prediction that I hope will cause it not to happen. Ben, can you say something happier in under 60 seconds?
I'm going to close out with a little more darkness, actually, because it's 2020. I mean, I tried. I'm an optimist, but it's been testing me this year. I think, we alluded to the kind of class structure, the occupational structure, the kind of gradations in the social hierarchy in tech earlier. And I think it's quite clear that the COVID crisis is hardening that hierarchy, making the divisions even greater. A good example of this is you have the kind of elite white collar layer. Folks are working at home at this point, at least until next year, probably indefinitely, honestly. And blue collar folks, at a lot of the big firms have been continuing to get paid, which is great. But the question is, if this goes into 2021, 2022, beyond, I mean, if we never really get back to normal, but this is the new normal, what happens to all the security guards, dining hall workers, shuttle bus drivers, and so on? I mean, there's a lot of folks who depend on this for their livelihood. And another element I'd point to is the kind of gradations within white collar workers are likely to grow as well. As part of moving to remote work, people have been relocating, and then their compensation is getting adjusted based on their new location. So I think, you know, that pyramid that we've been discussing before is likely to get even more stretched out, and for the kind of divisions between the levels to become even more impermeable. So I think that's a really nice thought to end on. My bad.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for doing this. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Moira. And thank you, Anna, for a really awesome talk. I'd also like to remind everyone, this session is going to be followed by another one tonight, Tim Huang in conversation with Allison Arif. Also, I encourage you all, please, please, please do buy copies of the book. City Lights is an indie, and it really supports us in the time of COVID. We'll have 2 more sessions tomorrow and a final panel discussion on Wednesday. To learn more, you can check out the Gray Area website as well as the City Lights website. And really, thank you all, and looking forward to seeing you again very soon.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks so much, Peter. Wish you were there in the picture with you.
Thanks everyone for coming.